Now, if your photos randomly look too dark or too bright, it's probably not your camera. It's metering, and it's way simpler than what people actually make it. You see, metering is one of those terms in photography which sound very technical at first and maybe scary sometimes, but once you discover metering and you unlock that superpower of metering, you really level up your photography. So in this video, I'll try to explain all about metering, what it is, how it works, why is it so special. We'll also go through each metering mode and I will show you how it impacts your photos. And in the end, we will also talk about the common beginner mistakes about metering so that you can avoid it when you take photos. And without waiting any further, let's continue. Now let's kill the confusion first and understand what metering is in way simpler terms. So metering or camera metering is simply how your camera decides how bright or dark your scene should be, right? That's all it is. Your camera looks at a scene and tries to make it not too dark or too bright. That's what metering is. Simple. But the thing is, how does your camera actually decide how bright or dark the photo should be? Your camera actually uses something called 18% gray or medium gray. This 18% gray or medium gray is the measure of average brightness, right? So your camera looks at a scene and sees if the scene is at 18% gray. Now, if your scene is too bright, your camera will make it darker so that you are closer to 18% gray or medium gray. Or if your scene is too dark, then the camera will brighten up so that you are closer again to 18% gray or medium gray, right? So all in all, the camera looks at a scene and tries to make it closer to average brightness or 18% or medium gray. That's the reason why photos taken in snowy conditions actually look a bit darker, and photos taken in low light with dark subjects actually look washed out, because in both cases the camera is actually trying to make the whole scene come closer to 18% or medium gray. Now let's suppose your scene is too bright, right? And let's suppose you are on auto ISO. This means your camera metering is on and the camera will now make your scene a bit darker so that you are closer to 18% gray or average brightness. But now you have a problem. Your subject has now become too dark. It's not well exposed. Now you have a choice of either correcting the exposure using the exposure dial. But now if you do that, again the whole scene is too bright or blown out. So now you are stuck. Either you can follow the camera and have a badly exposed subject, or you can follow your gut instinct and have a blown out scene. So, is there no other way? Actually, there is, and that's why we have metering modes. You see, by using metering modes, you can help the camera to understand where your subject is. You basically tell the camera that this is the area in the scene that I really care about. So, please reset the exposure of the whole scene according to the average brightness of that area. You can tell the camera that you care about the whole scene, or maybe you care only about the middle part of the scene, or maybe a tiny part of the scene, right? And that's what the camera looks at and calculates average brightness based on that area. Now, we have a lot of different metering modes, and a lot of them are common to different camera manufacturers, and we will go through each of them one by one. Now, the first metering mode is average or screen metering mode. It simply takes the screen, calculates average brightness based on the whole screen, right, and readjusts the exposure. It does not consider where your subject is, it does not consider different lighting conditions on different parts of the photo. It's simple but not intelligent. Now this is not ideal, and in this metering mode you have to compensate or correct the exposure quite a lot manually by yourself. Now the next metering mode is actually quite the opposite. This is called the multi-metering mode or evaluative metering mode. It splits the screen into different sections and analyzes them, and it runs complex mathematics and calculates average brightness based on those calculations. This is the most accurate metering mode and also the most beginner friendly, because you will never have to compensate the exposure manually yourself. Very rarely you will have to do anything by yourself. So if you are a beginner, or if you don't know much about metering and you just need to have good exposure, you can just set your metering mode to evaluative multi-metering mode and sit back and relax, right? That's how good it is. Now, every metering mode that we have discussed so far considers the whole screen. But what happens if you want to focus on your subject only and readjust the exposure based on your subject? So the next one actually helps us to do that. The next metering mode is called center weighted metering mode. And what it does is it reads the whole screen, but it actually gives more weightage or priority to the middle part of the screen. The camera will look at the middle of your screen where your subject is and calculate average brightness based on the middle part. It will give weightage to other parts of the screen also, but not too much, right? So in the end, you will have a really well exposed photo, especially your subject will be really nicely exposed. Now, although center weighted metering mode is quite good, but there is a problem. You see, our subject is not going to be in the middle of the scene always, right? We can also be following rule of thirds and other different compositions. So we need a way in which we can tell the camera to focus on any part of the scene, right? No matter where our subject is, instead of just the center. And that's where the next metering mode comes in. The next metering mode is called spot metering mode. And as the name suggests, you will tell the camera what spot or area in the scene to focus on, and the camera will calculate average brightness based on that small area, right? And then readjust the exposure of the whole scene based on that area. This means that now you have a well exposed photo no matter where your subject is in the scene. Now, all these metering modes are quite good, honestly, and they make sure that you have a well exposed photo in different lighting conditions and situations. But sometimes we don't want that. Sometimes we want a very high contrast photo and we just want to protect the highlights. So in that case, the next metering mode comes in handy. The last metering mode that I want to talk about today is a highlight weighted metering mode. And what it does is, it simply wants to protect your highlights from blowing out, right? It wants to preserve your highlights. That's all it wants to do, right? So once you switch that mode on, it will try to find where your highlights are and will readjust the exposure only on the brighter areas of your scene or where the highlights are blowing out. It doesn't really care about your dark areas, it doesn't really care about your shadows, it only wants to protect the highlights. Now I have created a decision tree for you, which means you can ask all these questions to yourself based on the type of photos you want to take, and this will help you decide what kind of metering mode you should use. Now at this point, there are a couple of things that we should know. Firstly, as a photographer, you have full control over the exposure of your scene. So even if you are on metering and the camera adjusts the exposure according to average brightness, you can still readjust the exposure as you like using the exposure dial on your camera, right? And this is because you know what you are taking photos of. You know your subject, right? So the camera gives full control to you even though it readjusts the exposure. Secondly, the metering function only works if you are on any kind of auto mode. So if you are working on full auto mode, or maybe you have auto ISO or shutter priority or aperture priority, only then the metering will work. So if you are taking photos on manual mode, then the camera metering would not work. But you can still use metering to get well exposed photo if you are shooting on full manual mode. All you have to do is switch to spot metering on your settings and then focus on the most neutral gray area of the scene, right? And focus on that. Now start compensating the exposure towards zero with your exposure dial, right? Once you get to zero, your photo is well exposed. Now at this point, we have understood how to use the superpower of metering. Remember my analogy of video games? So now you know what metering does, how it can level up your photography. You have got that superpower. You have unlocked it. But with great power comes great responsibility, right? So now we need to understand the common beginner mistakes that people usually do with metering and how you can avoid it. The first mistake that I want to talk about is using spot metering incorrectly or in wrong situations. You see, spot metering actually gives you a very tiny area to focus on. You have to be very precise because your whole exposure of the scene depends on that tiny area. But a lot of people actually focus on moving subjects, fast moving subjects or black and white scenes. Now these things actually confuse your camera. It does not know how to calculate average brightness anymore, and so your exposure goes crazy. It's all over the place. Now the second mistake that people do is they are afraid of changing the exposure themselves. Now if you are on metering and you are on automatic modes, the camera will try to do a good job to get you a well exposed photo, but it's not always perfect. So if you feel inside you that the exposure is not the way you want, you can always compensate the exposure or readjust the exposure using the exposure dial and the exposure meter on the bottom of the screen. The only goal you should have is to bring your exposure closer to 0 on the exposure meter, and you can use the dial for it. Now, the third and final mistake that people usually do is using the wrong metering mode as default. In general, our cameras use the screen or average metering mode as default, which is bad because the screen or average metering mode is very simple and it's actually quite dumb, and it makes a lot of mistakes. So if you shoot on auto mode and if you are unsure of what metering mode you should use, then you can simply set your metering mode to multi or evaluative and sit back and relax. Right, so this is all about metering, and you can see it's a superpower. It can literally instantly level up your photography if you know how to use metering in the right conditions in the right way. Actually, it could have been a really good hook in the beginning. But anyway, now if you have come this far in the video, I am assuming that you take photos in auto mode. But if you do take photos in manual mode, perhaps, then don't feel that without using metering mode you can't get good photos. Our main goal is to have a well exposed photo, whether we are taking photos in manual mode or auto mode, right? It doesn't matter if you use metering or not. It matters you have a well exposed photo. So I really hope that you enjoyed this video. And if you did, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and give this video a thumbs up. I would really appreciate it. I hope you keep taking good photos. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.